notepad file behind it, had nothing else open but the Python interpreter, and had my mouse cursor specifically on the GUID field, this would work perfectly. Literally, all this script is doing is check if I've pressed escape and stop everything if I have, Control F, enter, hold shift, right arrow 8 times, release shift, mouse click, Control A, Control C, Alt tab, Control V, enter, Alt tab, start again, with a few half-second waits between actions to account for any slight delays.
Oh, I think I might have figured it out. So, hold on.
So the system is that once it's selected 8 characters beyond the initial BLDG name underscore, I've placed the cursor over the GUID field, it clicks once, it issues Control A to select all, and Control C to copy it. Then it does Alt Tab to switch to Notepad, where it then does Control V to paste. It doesn't just do that. Before issuing the Control V, it checks that there is something in the clipboard at all, because after one random thing, it places it on the clipboard with nothing. So if there's still nothing, like that check, and something happened during the copy process, and it didn't actually copy. So what it then does is it loops back to click select all copy, because previously, once it had alt tabbed over to Notepad was in front of this side where the GUID field was. When that happened and it looped back around to click, all that click did was click back onto Notepad, which meant that the Control A, Control C would just select all of Notepad and then copy that, which is when then everything got out of sync and everything started to fall apart. So that's how I've solved it. I didn't realise that was the problem, but I just kind of had a hunch of maybe if I move Notepad so it's not away from, so it's not covering up the GUID field, that would work. And then it seemed to be working, and I didn't realise why. And then I was shooting B-roll and it suddenly hit me when I noticed sometimes it would stay on Notepad for longer.
Oh yeah, and also when you stop the script or it finishes, it leaves you with shift still held down, which somehow led to this being printed out, and me just writing a separate script to run afterwards to unshift because I didn't want to risk breaking the main one and couldn't figure out any better way to do it. So anyway, a few more little scripts later, I had the GUID strings in game.json and crypt format, albeit all with the same PID.
What does that mean anyway? I don't know!
Regardless, I slapped this onto my phone just to see what would happen. Clearly, I'd used the DID for the chum making machine, but hey, it's still working. The fact an item can continue to exist and fully function while attached to the wrong GUID string brings into question why items have 2 identifier values attached to them in the first place, but we'll press on.
I don't know very much about anything.
The DID values, as previously discussed, were trivial for a script to extract, and before long I had a fully functional DID reinsertion script. It was at this point that everything started to fall apart. Now, I was doing all this several months ago, so I don't really remember the details, but according to my folder names, it was here that I went on an entirely misguided and disastrous resident DID-based tangent, then eventually came back from that and attempted to add whatever it was I was missing here through different means. Throughout this whole process, I'd occasionally wondered where all the textures actually were, among other things, and it was only at this point that I realised something that arguably should have been blindingly obvious, and that anyone who knows anything about Android app backends has probably been shouting at the screen this whole time. The OBB file is just an archive of other files, like a zip. At first I thought this was just an interesting thing to figure out and another potential belated way to get the developer menu working. Still couldn't get it to work. But that overall it didn't really impact the project, until I realised that within the OBB was the game.json for Patchy's Town.
Yes, I'm in. Box to emoting, I've got my hands on her innards.
For the uninitiated, this was essentially a sample town, supposedly made by Patchy the Pirate, to demonstrate all of the various things you could get in the game. I'd assumed before that this was hosted externally or downloaded separately or something because it hadn't worked at all while messing around with the game this time, but sure enough, it was here. And if we just slap this game.json in place of my game.json...
Henmania!
Hey, Matt.
I actually tried to do this back in 2021, but presumably because I was just trying to copy bits of data out of the OBB file, I didn't get anywhere with it. There's a few things missing, but we can easily hack those back in manually. The only thing I haven't been able to get in is, weirdly, Gary. Despite obviously being an integral character to the show, and even being involved in the opening cutscene and dialogue of this very game, he, as far as I'm aware, was only added right at the absolute tail end of the game's run, potentially even being the last thing ever added, a time which this OBB file sadly seems to predate. So that sucks. As a side note, the OBB also contains all the dialogue from the seasonal events, which I can check thanks to my younger self for some reason screenshotting a whole bunch of it, but I also haven't been able to figure out how to trigger them. Although sometimes I accidentally trigger Patchy telling me Christmas was over and I didn't finish the quests, even if I tried setting my phone's date to mid-December, with the game having no other way of checking what day it was. As such, this is very much not a perfect experience, but it's a heck of a lot better than it being completely unplayable, and I think as far as I can get with my very limited knowledge of programming and generally what the heck I'm doing. Maybe someone else with a much more in-depth knowledge of how Android games work can take a look at everything so far and figure out the finer details. Now obviously that was all Android, and as for iOS, at first here I was just going to make a joke along the lines of get an Android phone, you get what you give, and then show this.
I can't send my mom certain videos, or she can't send me certain videos, and so we leave.
Buy your mom an iPhone.
But then I realised that, first of all, that's not the philosophy I like to have in my life. That was just a bit of a joke. You should use whatever tech you like using and not judge other people for whatever they choose to use. But more importantly, I then realised that the game was still installed on my iPhone SE, which I downloaded a bunch of old apps onto for the sake of nostalgia and last resort archival before I stopped daily driving it back in February 2021. And sure enough, it is still fully functional, presumably because this phone hasn't been online due to being both dead and not connected to the network since we've switched ISPs a few times since then. In fact, not only was the game here and fully functional, but also... So logically, I should be able to get the iOS equivalent of the OBB data out of this phone. So you know what that means? We're jailbreaking it.
Now, I've never successfully gotten that to work before. So yeah.
Even though the first gen SE got software updates to nearly 16, another benefit of this phone sitting offline for 3 years is that it's still on iOS 14.7.1. And you know what's good about iOS 14.7.1?
You're insecure, you're insecure, you're insecure, you're insecure.
I did briefly think I'd been lied to, but it turned out I just needed to enable untested iOS versions, which wasn't mildly unnerving at all. You can jailbreak later iOS versions, but if this turned out to be higher, I would have to learn a new jailbreaking method, which would take a few minutes of my time, so this was still nice. Unfortunately, something I hadn't factored in beforehand was the fact I'd need a network connection to then install Cydia and any other tweaks from there. And as I'd seen on Android, even without having the app open, connecting to the internet somehow has the potential to give the app an opportunity to kill itself. Sure, I'd made a backup of the phone beforehand, but if I had to fall back on that, the only version of iOS I'd be able to install would be 15.8.2, because that's the only version still signed by Apple for this phone, which I would then not be able to jailbreak with this method, and I'd be back to square one finding a legitimate jailbreak for that OS, which would be annoying, although not as big of an issue as I for some reason built it up to be throughout this paragraph. Regardless, I bit the bullet and connected. I installed a file manager and got to work tracking down the game files. After having no success getting them off the phone with the file manager's network transfer features or share sheet, I eventually learned what Apple File Conduit is and pulled the files via iMazing. Unlike in Android, where an app's files can be distributed between its directory in Android/data and Android/OBB, iOS employs sandboxing to keep every app contained within itself. This is generally a security feature, and here means that everything we need should be in one place. I backed up an unaltered copy of both the apps file and a .zip I'd made on the phone, and then had a bit of a browse. Comparing this to the contents of the Android OBB file, it seems to all be here, with the only exception being this bin folder. On Android, this makes up the majority of the size of the OBB, and the iOS build is slightly smaller, but that could just be down to iOS machine code being mildly more efficiently compiled than Android. Although with that said, there's evidence of the game being built in Unity, in which case the only native machine code we'd be dealing with here would be a C# interpreter. I think. I'm not 100% confident in my knowledge of how it works, but I'm pretty sure it's basically that.
Why don't you back it up with a source? My source is
Regardless, the only way to be entirely sure this was all the files you'd need would be to try and get the game running using only these on another iPhone. So you know what that means. Time to pull another phone from the pile. My other SE, formerly belonging to my dad, was used and updated all the way through to the bitter end, so for simplicity's sake we'll be using this iPhone 6, originally belonging to a certain brick wall, if you know you know, before being sold on to a man with an Angry dad and in turn being sold on to me, where it went on to be used in a film project that never went anywhere, but mainly because I wanted a clean slate to mess around with jailbreaking the first time round. As you can see, it's in perfect working order. Employing the assistance of an HDMI dongle I had to go on a jog to get because I'd left it elsewhere.
I'm a natural jogger.
And a capture card before realising you can achieve the same thing just over regular USB, which I'm surprised I didn't know you could do until now. I easily jailbroke iOS 12 and slapped the files into place. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work. I then tried extracting the app state from the first phone and then injecting it back into the second phone, all using iMazing. And while this did eventually work, even if it had to, as far as I can tell, make a backup of the second phone, inject the app into that backup, and then apply said backup back onto the phone, the iMazing extract